Welcome back. Now we're turning to the war in Ukraine, where tensions between Russia and Britain are rising sharply. Moscow says it could strike British military targets inside and outside Ukraine in response to Ukrainian attacks using British-made long-range missiles. The warning came from Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, who accused Britain of moving closer to becoming directly involved in the conflict. Russia says Ukrainian forces have used Franco-British Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles to strike targets inside Russia and territory Moscow claims as its own. London, however, says it stands firmly behind Ukraine and remains committed to providing Kiev with the equipment it needs to defend itself. The latest warning also follows Britain's decision to allow Ukraine access to classified technology to begin producing its own Storm Shadow missiles, weapons capable of striking deep inside Russian territory. France has also approved technology licensing linked to the European missile. And Moscow has warned both Britain and France that they are, in its words, playing with fire. So how seriously should we take this latest Russian warning? Could Moscow actually target British military facilities? And does the growing use of Western weapons inside Russia increase the risk of a direct confrontation between Russia? Well, for the latest from Moscow, let's bring in our correspondent, Dasha Chernyshova. Thank you, Dasha, for joining me here on World Tonight. Well, Dasha, what exactly is Moscow threatening when it says British military targets could be struck?
Well, indeed, this is the warning coming from the Russian Foreign Ministry, and they have been saying in Moscow that the United Kingdom is involved into this conflict in Ukraine through the hands of Ukrainians who are using the UK-produced military equipment. And the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman has said that Moscow can actually strike military facilities and equipment in Ukraine and beyond, issuing quite a broad warning to the United Kingdom here. We've been hearing the Russian MOD lots of times saying that they are attacking the places where Ukrainian military are producing and storing weapons, but those were on the Ukrainian territory. Now the warning says they can be going beyond the borders of Ukraine. Obviously, this is the signal that Moscow is sending to the West, and we've heard the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov saying that the UK is playing the most destructive and unconstructive role in the conflict with Ukraine. So we understand that Russia treats the United Kingdom as one of the perpetrators, as one of the instigators that is adding fuel to the fire of this conflict. But so far, we haven't heard from the Russian side any particular threat against any sort of military installation that the UK has in its capacity or another location that Moscow will be willing to attack. So far, this is a very strong warning that Moscow is sending, but again, no concrete details have been provided by any of the Russian ministries.
As you mentioned, Russia has issued similar warnings before. Why does the latest statement appear to carry greater urgency? As you just said, of course, that it kind of expands beyond Ukraine. But still, why this is more serious than it was before?
Well, Moscow has been repeatedly saying that the UK is involved into this conflict by supplying its weapons, but by also instigating and energizing the Ukrainian efforts, but also by providing the intelligence data. Now, Russia is saying that the UK is also burying their hands because of the strikes that Ukraine is making against targets deep into the Russian territory. So this is an escalation phase that we are now seeing since the middle of July. Ukraine started the attacks against multiple warehouses deep into the Russian territory, against Wildberries marketplace, Ozon marketplace, oil refineries since the start of this summer. All of those attacks are indeed bearing the brunt, particularly for the civilian population who are seeing the conflict being close to their doorsteps. And we've seen the summer months in Russia being the bloodiest for the civilians. The death toll among the civilian population because of the Ukrainian attacks has increased, and this warning from Russia comes at this time of this escalation. But keep in mind that the UK is a member of NATO, so obviously there is a risk of further escalation. And if Russia goes on to attack any UK facility, obviously Moscow understands the risk, and the Russian side has been saying that it has no plans to attack NATO.
Right. Well, talking about, Britain, how significant is Britain's decision to allow Ukraine access to technology to produce Storm Shadow missiles domestically?
You cannot underestimate this statement. Obviously, Moscow is closely monitoring what sort of weapons Ukraine is receiving from the Western countries, but also this decision does mean that Ukraine is becoming from the recipient into the producer of this sort of weapons. So this is a threat for Moscow. So we may see the Russian side intensifying their strikes on the facilities where those weapons are going to be produced. So obviously, it is a very important step, but again, you have to keep in mind that Moscow has been saying it would prefer the means of diplomacy, and they were calling on the Western countries to encourage Ukraine to negotiate. But as things go forward, we are not seeing any progress on the diplomatic front, and the two sides are only saying that they are going to intensify the fighting. So this decision to provide those blueprints does mean that there will be more strikes that Moscow will be carrying out against Ukraine to make sure their borders and the targets inside Russia are well protected.
I think, Dasha, here it's also important to stress that, since this announcement and those warnings came, the sensation and about this and the feeling and the question actually that we can hear a lot is, could Russia realistically actually target British military installations outside Ukraine, or this is primarily sort of like, let's call it, warning to London?
At this stage, it does sound more like a warning, but obviously things could change quickly should there be more strikes against the targets deep into the Russian territory carried out with the use of the UK-produced military equipment. And this is probably the thing that is fueling this conflict. We've seen in Russia the economy now turning to the problems, not just because of the increased military spending, but day-to-day life is being threatened because of the Ukrainian strikes. Very often they are carried out, we understand, with the UK-supplied weapons. Therefore, Russia making these statements is sending the signal to the United Kingdom that they have to abandon this rhetoric that is only adding fuel to the fire of this conflict. Because in Russia's perspective, these weapons are not going to help Ukraine on the battlefield. They insist that they hold the upper hand, the strategic advantage on the front lines. So from the Russian perspective, the supplies of these weapons are only going to prolong and extend this conflict, something that the Russian side wants to end. But they do say that in the absence of the diplomatic progress, they have to resort to military means. Obviously, this is how it is seen in Moscow. The views may be different in Ukraine, but Russia insists that those weapons are going to prolong the suffering of the civilian people on both sides.
And look, well, Moscow also has accused Ukraine of using British missiles against civilian areas. What do we know about those claims, and what does Ukraine said in response?
Well, we have seen Ukraine attacking, first of all, the oil refineries in Russia. The attacks are multiple. There have been several instances where oil refineries were hit that took place in June, that took place in July, and now by August, when those attacks have subsided, we are seeing the repeated attacks against the same oil refineries that are going through the repairs, and then they are attacked again. What it is leading to is the fuel shortage on the Russian roads, and we are seeing many more motorists saying that they are going to wait in long lines to get their cars going because they need the petrol, and the oil refineries are not supplying enough of that petrol. But it is affecting the economy wider. We are seeing inflation skyrocketing because of that. We are seeing logistics being much more complicated and expensive, and then we've seen the Ukrainian strikes also attacking the warehouses of largest marketplaces. They do account for a large portion of the Russian economy. And obviously, all that is affecting the daily routines of the people. And those are the facilities that are located not in the areas where the military are typically located, but in the areas where civilian population lives. So the biggest problem here is actually that those strikes are affecting many more civilians on the Russian territory, be it through the indirect economic impact, through inconveniences, or directly because of those attacks and the falling debris from the drones. We are seeing more and more people dying in different parts of the country, including deep into the central Russia, in the Urals, and some of those strikes going hundreds and thousands of kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. So obviously for Russia, it is a big deal.
Look, Dasha, what could you say about the reports that CIA chief warns Moscow that not to engage with NATO directly? How authentic are these reports?
Well, it's a very interesting narrative that we are seeing. John Ratcliffe's visit to Moscow has been covered very differently in the Western media and here domestically on the Russian soil. We are seeing the Western media saying that he came to Moscow with some sort of a warning amid the reports that Moscow is allegedly preparing to attack NATO. The Kremlin saying these plans are nonsense, these reports are nonsense, and Moscow is not going to attack NATO. But in Russia, the CIA director's visit has been covered differently. If you look at the official narrative, the Kremlin is saying this is purely a routine. Contacts between the special services are important. They stress that they are quite regular. But if you look at the analytics of the Russian political observers, they all say that Ratcliffe might have been coming to Moscow with some sort of a plan to end the conflict in Ukraine, something new that has emerged recently because the United States is in a rush to end the conflict and to bring some results before midterm elections. So obviously with those plans of Russia, as they are reported in the West, to attack NATO, Moscow is denying that. But John Ratcliffe's visit is something that is closely monitored because we understand that we will not know many of the details of that visit, but certainly the repercussions and the follow-up from that decisions, from the conversations that he held in Moscow, is something that is going to impact the further steps between Russia and the United States.
All right, Dasha, well, thank you so much for joining me here on World Tonight. I appreciate your time and all the updates.